Hi, my name is Peter Andras. I'm professor at Edinburgh Napier University. This is my lecture series on the evolution of complex systems. This is lecture 13, Politics and Economics, Interactions. This is part 2 of lecture 13. So in this lecture, we continue the previous discussion about how politics and economics are interacting, how they set environmental pressures for each other, how they change the rules, how they change the boundaries, and also how new interface systems may emerge on the interface between these two subsystems of the society. So, we discussed earlier about money, how it works in the economy, and one aspect of the money is how much money is there in the economy. Now, this is in the earlier days when money was related to the coins that are produced and effectively a gold and silver content of these coins. The amount of money in the economy was mostly dependent on how many coins were in circulation and how fast the circulation was. However, the speed of circulation was not very variable. It's really dependent on how many coins are there available in the economy. Now, when economists shifted to use paper money, where the value of the money became a value by convention, the ability of the state to change the volume of the money in the economy increased. Now, partly that changes through the banking system, how the banking system is regulated, but potentially there is also the option of producing more money in the economy by political decision. Now, the fiscal policy is about the taxation, how much taxes, fees, tariffs should be imposed on economic communications. And effectively, this sets out what part of the money exchanged in the economy should go to the government to finance the delivery of governmental services and operations. And that is set again by a governmental decision on the levels of taxation and tariffs. So that the level of taxes like VAT or the person income tax or the tariffs of imported goods and services, these are set by political decisions by the government, and they effectively provide the income for the government that they can spend on providing the governmental services, maintaining the government organizations. Now, on the other side, there is the monetary policy, which is the regulation of the banks and of the volume of the money and the amount of money present in the economy. And this operates, for example, by setting the base interest rate. So this is the interest rate at which the central bank lends money to the commercial banks, or setting the level of the bank reserves, which is the amount or the ratio of the money that banks need to retain as reserves relative to the amount of money they get as deposits, or that they manage as deposits. So banks lend money that the depositors deposit to them, and in this way they increase the volume of money within the economy. If the level of bank reserves is increased relative to the deposits, they have to retain a larger amount that is not allowed to be lent out. Then, of course, that shrinks the amount of money within the economy. Similarly, if the central bank increases the interest rate, the base interest rate that the banks need to pay to the central bank in order to get money from the central bank when they need that, again, that reduces the money in the economy, or when these changes are reverse way, that can increase the volume of money within the economy. So this is how the central bank and the banking system influences the volume of money in the economy. There are many countries in the Western world. The central banks have autonomy from the government, which means that the government cannot force the central bank to follow particular monetary policy, but they aim to deliver monetary policy which provides stability and growth for the economy. Of course, this is not always the case. Not all countries is the case. There are countries where central banks are under more political control, where the government can influence much more the monetary policy as well, in addition to the fiscal policy. Now, as we discussed earlier, in general, in order to grow an economy, there should be some small or possibly moderate level of inflation. The reason is that it is impossible to guess exactly how much more money is required to support the growth, and it is better to provide a little bit more than a little bit less, because a little bit less triggers deflation and recession. So the usual case is that there is some small or moderate level inflation in the economy. More recently, typical central banks aimed in developed countries for about 2% annual inflation. Now, the inflation represents how the evolution of goods and services in money terms is changing. So how much more expensive in money terms the goods and services become over time, over a year. Now, of course, governments can intervene. As I said, since paper money has been invented, governments have much more ability to intervene in the regulation of the volume of money in the economy. Even before, they could do this, for example, by mixing more silver or copper into the coins and having less gold or silver in these coins. But with the invention and adoption of paper money and in particular electronic money, governments have much more ability to intervene in the volume of money within the economy. So the government needs to pay the bill to maintain their organization and their services. For example, they may take out a loan to develop infrastructure, or the budget may have some prescription about how much deficit is allowed and so on. So the government ultimately needs to pay these bills, and in some cases, the government simply prints more money in order to be able to pay these services. This is when the economy is not generating enough revenue for the government to pay as much services that they intend to deliver. So, for example, this happened in Germany in the 1920s, in Brazil in the 1980s, in Bulgaria in the 1990s, more recently in Zimbabwe, when hyperinflation happens, when there is very rapid change of valuation of the goods and services, and the amounts of change, the jumps, are becoming very unpredictable. So these leads to unpredictable prices, which shrinks the economy because it is just unpredictable how much should company budget for, to prepare for, in terms of this very variable economy. So companies often decide not to produce because they run out of their money, and the whole economy is shrinking. Now, how these link together is that from the politics perspective, from the perspective of political system and political power, if there are insufficient services, that leads to dissatisfaction among the population, among the people who ultimately will vote in the next elections. So there is a pressure on the political system, on the politicians, to to solve the problem in some way, because the discourse in the political system comes about insufficient investment, insufficient services, insufficient jobs, possibly. And that, in some cases, leads to the printing of the money, where the political system ultimately generates inflation. Now, it should be noted here that inflation can be generated, change of prices can be generated by a number of reasons. For example, the amount of materials that are needed for the products may become less, making the materials more pricey, leading up the prices of the materials that are produced. So, for example, if the production of the gas or the availability of natural gas on the world market gets reduced, that leads to an increase in the gas prices for the companies, and that leads to an increase of everything that depends on energy, which includes really everything in the economy. So there is an inflationary pressure, but that's not led by the political system, but rather is part of the economic system. So, however, in this particular case, when there is a pressure on politics to print money, sometimes the political system leads to that conclusion that they effectively print more money in one or another way, or generate more money within the economy. And this leads to the communication inflation within economies, because the prices become less stable, less predictable. So effectively, how the economics is working in this more uncertain environment is changing. So in this way, the political system penetrates the economic system and influences how the economic system works, how the organizations within the economic system work. Now let's have a look at another example. And this is the distribution of economic resources within the society. So economic resources, money, housing, jobs, are needed for everybody in order to have a satisfying and enjoyable life. So clearly, these are not distributed equally across society, practically in every society. And when the lack of equality of this distribution becomes large and becomes a major part of the political discourse, then that discourse impacts on the politics as well. So, for example, such unequal distribution perceptions becoming dominant in the society, for example, happened in France in the late 18th century or in Russia in the early 20th century, where the perception of the majority, of a vast majority of society, was that the distribution of wealth, the distribution of economic resources was very unfair, very unequal. Now, of course, this leads to changing power talk, a changing discourse in the context of the political system, because the inequality of economic resources and the distribution of these resources becomes a dominant topic. It is a key topic that arranges and organizes the political discourse, the political communications within the political system. So in this way, the economics influences strongly the rules of politics. And in particular, in such situations, a new politics is emerging, which changes fundamentally how the political system works. It is the revolutionary politics, which undermines the existing political system, introduces fundamentally new ways of communicating in politics and new ways of attracting political support across the population. So in this way, the politics is penetrated by the economics to the extent that the rules of political communications change fundamentally. Effectively, a new political system is set up after the revolution. Now, another example that we should consider is the case of communism. Now, communist countries have been around since 1917. Many more have been around since 1947, in particular in Europe, Asia, and in other parts as well, including America and Africa. Now, the core idea of communist political and economic system is the equal sharing of economic resources. So the political system is focused on resource distribution, and in particular in communism, the idea is that it is somehow possible to provide equal sharing of the resources where all needs are met at the level of those needs. Yeah. Of course, as history shows, most of these countries did not work very well. In fact, none of them worked very well. The remaining communist countries like Cuba and North Korea are not very pleasant places, and people struggle and suffer in these countries. And this happened in many other countries where communism ruled over the last decades, in particular since the Second World War. Now, what happens in these economic systems where communism is the dominant political system? The communications change it changes how they are framed. So the relevance of party documents, the relevance of political communications increases very much. The reporting about economic performance, economic communications, how companies work, is according to the plans that were set by the party, and all the communications in the economics are aligned with political communications. So effectively what this means is many economic decisions become political decisions. So the referencing is mainly to political communications. For example, a factory may produce products for the deposit just in order to keep the workers working. So there is no unemployment. In many other ways, the economic decisions quite often are primarily political decisions, which effectively means that in communism, economics as a system shrinks, because the political system takes over a large part of the economics by influencing the economic decision making, by replacing the economic reasoning by political reasoning. So many economic communications which would follow in a non-communist system, a market economy, they would follow economic reasoning and reference other economic communications. In the communist system become political communication, referencing political communications, and becoming a political decision. Of course, that means that the economy is shrinking under the strong influence of the political system, leads to less working of the economy, leads ultimately to fewer products, fewer services, lower living standards overall. And of course, that's what we have seen back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, where most of the communist countries ended to be communist countries and became market economy driven multi-party systems, where in all these countries what it was possible to found after the collapse of communism were really shrunk, destroyed economies, which took a long time to recover and regrow. And people in those economies lived in very impoverished state. They had very much lower quality of life than in countries which had market economies. Now, let's move on to another aspect. This is state services. And state services, of course, they happened very large extent in communist countries where everything became a state-owned organization. Everything was a state service. However, state services are also present in many market economies as well, or have been present in the past. So, for example, if you consider railroads, energy services, telecommunications, the kind of services which are in a state of kind of natural monopoly because they require huge investments and maintenance of very substantial infrastructure. So in these areas of economy, at various stages, in various states, the service was run effectively as a state service. Now, the problem with running these services as state services is that the politics impacts the state because the state is part of the political system. It is an institution within the political system. Having run these economic services as state services effectively integrates them into political institution, which is the state, which ultimately means that the economic logic, which is normally would be used to make decisions within the companies providing these services, get mixed with political logic. Now, sometimes that's very useful and possibly leads to benefits as well. However, over long term, that kind of interference is likely to reduce the impact of the economic logic on the running of these services. So services often are provided at political determined levels, and quite often there is a large bureaucracy. Typically they run a deficit. The quality of service is typically low on average, and the variance of it is quite possibly high. Kind of postcode lottery might often happen at a high level, meaning that some service providers, depending on the area, run much better than others, depending on other kind of random factors from the perspective of the economic organization and the service that is delivered. So the political objectives and economic realities interplay, and the political objectives are not always deliverable. So, for example, a railway system and a state-run system may run at consistently low quality. It may offer dirty carriages, it may not be on time, it may be plagued by strikes, and so on. So, what happens is that although there is a political intention to run these services as state services, the economic realities influence the decision making and the running of these services, which leads to the privatization in some cases. So, for example, in Britain, the railways were privatized. In many countries, the energy systems were privatized after being run by the state. Now, with privatization, the economics takes over, the economic communication becomes much more relevant than the political communications. The political rules lessen their effect and their impact on the organization. Now, note that these are often still quite natural monopolies. So the interference by politics doesn't fully stop, but it becomes less and more limited. And economic communications, the economic reasoning in the rules and the decision making become more dominant. This is generally what happens in the case of privatizations. However, the question is, does this privatization ultimately deliver a better service and better working of these services? Now, if the privatization leads to a competitive reorganization of that sector of the economy, then possibly there is a short decrease in the output, but a lot of bureaucracy is reduced, and there is a fast growth and typically a better service and better quality of services provided more efficiently by the new competing organizations in that sector of the economy. However, that doesn't always work. So sometimes the reorganization does not lead to a competitive sector. And then there is a continual need for state support, prices may stay high, the quality may stay low, and generally the politics gets still too much influence. So to give you some examples, consider, for example, telephony, the UK, where it was a monopoly, and then the monopoly gets broken down. Separate providers can provide telephony services, but there is still a kind of natural monopoly situation because of the cable network needs to be maintained, and that is running all the services. However, the services that run on the basis of the cable provider service can become much more efficient, and there is a competitive market building up, and that delivers much better service to the clients who use these services. So that change from monopolistic to competitive market worked very well. However, if you look at energy markets or railway service markets, you see in many cases that the privatization did not deliver fully the expected positive effects, because there, for example, in energy, in some cases the providers are too few. A single one has sufficient market dominance to effectively be able to blackmail the government, which by saying that if they don't provide the energy, then the whole energy system collapses because there is insufficient provided by the other competing organizations. So effectively that leads again to an intertwining of politics and economics, which doesn't work. In railway cases, again, in order to have sufficient competition, sufficiently many companies need to provide a service, which may require too much investment, and ultimately they end up providing a service in a monopolistic manner, at least in some areas of the sector, like geographic areas. So the privatization does not always work, but quite often works much better than the state running of the services. So in the case of privatization, generally economics take over a part of the previous political system, and the political system shrinks and lets the economics dominate for more of the services that were previously provided as state services. Now, we discussed about monetary policy and fiscal policy, and how the money and the regulation of the money works. And this leads to the emergence of the monetary politics on the interface, where you have specialist politicians and the specialist political language which is about monetary politics. So this is the language of politics, which deals with banks, the central bank in particular, the regulation of the monetary policy within the economy. So there are experts on the bank side, and also expert MPs, experts in the Ministry of Finance. And within the system of politics, there is an interface system growing, which is the system of monetary politics, or the subsystem within politics, which involves the experts who communicate about monetary politics, about the monetary system, the regulation of the monetary system, and that of course involves also the experts from the banks, from the side of the economy, who talk again about monetary politics. Another interface area is the party finances. So obviously, financing the party is very important. Each party needs some income to pay for their buildings, to pay for their staff, and so on. The question is how to run the party finances, how to run the party as an organization, which of course leads to the rules about how the party is run as an organization. There is a treasurer, there are other role holders within the party who deal with the party economics. It leads to special communications within the party. So these are communications which are in the context of the party. So these are political communications driven by political rationale, political reasoning. However, they also need to fit into the economic reasoning about how to run an organization. So what emerges on this interface is the party economics, which is about how parties are run as an economic organization. Okay, they provide a service in a sense, and they need to fit into the economic context. They have to run as an organization that has sufficient money to pay for its services, but at the same time, it also runs in the context of the political system, where many decisions are driven by political reasoning. So, to summarize, we looked at the political system and the economic system, and we considered a number of interactions and interpretations between them. We looked at how they provide environmental sanction pressures for each other, how they impact on each other to change the rules, change the boundaries of these systems. For example, in the context of communism, where the boundary of the political system expands and conquers many parts which would be belonging to the economic system before, or during privatizations when the reverse happens, many communications which would have more political references become much more economical reference communications. And finally, we looked at the emergence of new systems and interfaces, like the system of monetary politics, which is about the monetary system in the context of political system, and the system of party economics, which is within the context of parties and the discussions and decision making about how parties are run as organizations. Let's have a look at a few questions finally. Is it true that nationalization is a way of politics acting on economics changing its boundaries? And the answer is yes. So nationalization is a result of political decision making. When an industry, let's say railways or energy sector, gets nationalized. And it changes the boundaries of the economics by making this particular sector of the economy more under the influence of political communications and effectively limiting, to some extent, the role of the economic referencing and economic reasoning in the context of decision making of that sector of the economy. Next question. Is it true that revolutionary politics is the effect of the economics on politics by changing the rules of politics? And yes, what we discussed is that when the economics is such that the distribution of resources, and in particular the unequal distribution of resources, becomes a dominant topic in the political discourse, this leads to revolutionary politics and fundamental rewriting of the rules of the political system. So in this way, the economics impacts on politics, and the revolutionary politics is the result of this impact of the economics on the political system. Next question. Is it true that by allowing pubs to keep open after 11 p.m., the competition in the pub-club sector of the economy is changing? So let's assume that this was not the case previously. By changing the opening rules of pubs and clubs, that means that the competition in that sector is changing, because the pubs and clubs operate differently, they can keep open until later, they can offer more services, and that changes quite significantly how they compete with each other. Next question. Is it true that the economy is always the single major issue of opposition talks at elections? Well, not really. Other economy is quite often, it is the key issue. It is not always the single major issue. Quite often there are other major issues as well. For example, it can be healthcare, it can be immigration, it can be war at somewhere in the world, and so on. So there are many other issues that can become a major issue in the opposition talks at election, although quite often the economy is one of these major issues. Finally, is it true that there are several interface systems between politics and economics? And the answer is yes. We discussed about the monetary politics, we discussed about party economics, but in general, there are a number of interfaces between politics and economics, and these systems will grow on these interfaces where these two systems interact. Thank you.